Okay, hello. So the conference asked me to come and talk about some of the interesting stuff that's making its way into the CSS specs. And there's a whole heap of really interesting things kind of just landing in browsers at the moment and coming really soon. And so this talk really is just a very quick collection of things and various examples of things that I think are interesting, some of which are actually very usable now and others are kind of just on the horizon. One of the many hats I wear is as an invited expert to the CSS working group. However, this slide has some of the other things I'm involved with. And while I'm really interested in all of this new stuff, my kind of day job is as co-founder of a content management system product. And so I have to deal with all of the old browsers like everybody else. There's certainly no ivory towers here. And so as we go along, I'll be explaining the status of browser support for all of these things and ways to kind of deal with old browsers. So I'm going to start with really my favorite subject in CSS, and really the reason why I'm on the CSS working group at all, and that's layout. And this is a module which, if you've used Flexbox at all, you will be familiar with, although you might not have heard of its name, Box Alignment Level 3. Because it appears that for a very, very long time, vertical centering has been the hardest problem in web design. And so this is what box alignment and Flexbox as well are solving. So a lot of the reasons we're using Flexbox is basically to get that vertical alignment. I quite often end up turning something into a Flex container just so that I can align the things inside it. And this is how we do that in Flexbox. We're using the align items and justify content properties here to center the image vertically and horizontally. And those properties are part of the Flexbox spec. And if you do this, you'll end up with something like this. And we can have flex layouts, and we can align things all around that layout. So here I've got a flex container, the height of which is defined by the tall image, and we're aligning the other items against it. So we're using align self, and we're aligning the individual items on the cross-axis. So for Flexbox, we've got align self center, flex start, and flex end. So Flexbox is really cool, and so what we've done is we've got those properties that do alignment in Flexbox, and they've been taken out and put into this new specification called box alignment. And what box alignment lets us do is then apply those properties to other parts of layout, which ultimately might mean you could float an item and still use those alignment properties with it, rather than having to turn it into a flex container. So that's pretty cool. So we've got these properties that are part of box alignment, and we have alignment and also things like space distribution. And these are the properties. So we've got justify content, align content, justify self, align self, justify items, and align items. So while we haven't got to a point where we can use this stuff on block layout yet, we can't use it when we float something or position something, there is a specification where we've started to use these properties already. And that's CSS Grid Layout. Now, I've got practically a full-day workshop which deals with CSS Grid Layout. It's a brand new specification. I can talk about it all day, and do. I'll not now, but I'm going to show you some kind of edited highlights of that. So, sticking with alignment, this is how Grid implements the box alignment specification. So I'm actually creating the exact same layout I had for Flexbox, this time with Grid. I'm saying display Grid rather than display Flex. And then I'm setting up a 4-column layout. I'm using the repeat syntax. So I'm saying repeat 4 times a 1 fraction unit column. That 1FR is an interesting unit. It's a flex unit, a fraction unit that defines a fraction of the available space in the grid container. So if we have 4 1FR units, they each have 1 equal part of the space. We split the space into 4. And then here I'm using align self center, align self start rather than flex start, and align self end to align the items inside their grid areas, which gives us the same layout as the flex layout, but this time we're using grid and box alignment within grid. And these URLs here, when you get the slides at the end, you can click through, and they're all code pens, so you can have a look and play around with the code. So what's the difference with grid and Flexbox? Grid layout has been designed as a fit-for-purpose layout method, really for the first time for the web. And it's designed to work alongside other layout methods, including Flexbox. And the difference is really that it's for two-dimensional layouts, and that's laying things out both as a row and a column at the same time. So to use grid, as in the previous example, we say display grid, and then we define some columns and optionally some rows. So here I'm defining 3 columns, all of 1 fraction unit. And we've got the grid gap property, and that's going to define a 10-pixel gutter between those tracks. You can also use grid column gap and grid row gap to define those individually. And then if I have a set of items and they're inside that parent, which I've said display grid on, they're going to lay themselves out on the grid that I've defined, 1 in each cell of the grid. Now, if you try and get this kind of display using Flexbox, which many of you may have tried to do already, you say display flex, you let the items wrap, and then we're using a flex basis of 1, of 250 pixels and saying grow and shrink from that. Now, because Flexbox is one-dimensional, you get this. So although it's wrapping onto the next line, each row in Flexbox or column, if you're working by columns, becomes its own flex container. So that space distribution is happening across the row there. We get onto the second row, we've only got 2 cards, and so they just split the space between them. And that's the difference really between grid and Flexbox. Grid would keep those things strictly in their column tracks. The nice thing with Flexbox, though, is if we made this screen wider and there was more space, we could get more of those images would fit up next to each other. That's a pretty nice thing because we can have multiple numbers of flexible columns inside a container. And we can actually do this with grid as well, although it does involve a fairly baffling-looking syntax. So here I'm creating my grid. I'm using this autofill keyword in the repeat. Rather than using a value, rather than saying repeat 4 times, I'm saying autofill. So I'd like grid to fill as many column tracks as will fit into my container. And then I'm using this min-max thing. So I'm saying make those column tracks a minimum of 200 pixels, but a maximum of 1 fraction unit. The effect of that, because the fraction unit shares out all available space, we get as many 200 pixel column tracks as will fit, then the available space is distributed equally amongst the columns, which basically gives us the ability to have a flexible container with as many columns of between 200 pixels, and then the rest is sort of shared out with it, which is pretty neat. It allows the strict sort of rows and columns layout, but as many columns as fit. So min-max. That min-max thing has been created for grid layout because we need a way of doing that kind of track sizing. And it turns out it solves all sorts of interesting problems. Here's one. So this is the Tut Plus website, a tutorial website. And they've got one of these kind of boxy layouts on the homepage, which you kind of see all over the place used for navigation. The problem with these things is that in the real world, a lot of content comes out of content management systems, and the content editor comes along, and the designers thought, well, I'll just have 2 lines of content there. But they've got something really important to say that it needs a whole paragraph, and so they put that in, it breaks the layout. In this case, it's all overlapping, which isn't ideal. And I wondered if I could sort of do this kind of layout with grid and solve that sort of problem. And it turns out that I can. This is the layout that I created. I've got the 3 breakpoints which match the example that I was looking at. We've got a sort of mobile width and a wider width here, and then a far wider one. But again, we've got this thing where we've got these fixed height blocks, and that's part of the design, that even if there's a little bit of text in, you still want the block to show enough of the image. But what we want is that tolerance for extra content to get in there, to at least not break, even if that's not the design that I wanted. And so here's what we do. So as you can see on the right hand, the sort of top right block about angry people at balloon fiestas has got quite a bit more text than we expected. And it's expanded down. And what's happened is that the entire row has expanded, and so the 2 images next have also got more space in there, and they've been able to expand as well. So we're able to have a minimum size for our track of 150 pixels tall, but then expand out if more content gets in. And that's done by, again, using min-max. So here I'm saying make my tracks a minimum of 150 pixels tall and a maximum of auto. And auto will resolve to the content if it's not got any other height applied. So it will make enough space for whatever gets put into that box. Now, it might be that the designer would then come along and say, oh, I take out some of that content because I want those to look nice and neat, but at least it doesn't break, and it all lines up at the bottom of the image. So that's pretty cool. You can have a look at the example, the code links in my slides, and there's a few little things in there which are quite interesting about grid layout that you might like to have a look at. So I'll stay with grid a little bit longer and just talk a bit about the auto placement algorithm, because that's also something else that's very cool that's in grid layout. Now, you've already seen when we declare grid and we turn something into a grid, all of the child elements lay themselves out on that grid, which is just like with Flexbox. If you say display flex, all the items inside become flex items. So we can play around with this ability, and we can start creating some rules for different items so that they act differently when grid comes across them. So I was remembering the glorious days when we only had 216 colours to play with, and so I created a list of those web-safe colours inside just an unordered list with a class of colours. And I'm going to lay those out as a grid. So again, I'm using the ability to create as many columns, this time with a minimum of 80 pixels, and we're going to create them with a height of 80 pixels as well as a minimum. So I get little square boxes, and grid will lay out the items like this, which is quite pretty. But I can start playing around with this. I'm adding some classes. I've decided that the white and the black squares on the grid are actually going to take up a full row. So I'm saying start those. If you come across one with a class of white, start it on grid column line 1. So in this here, you can see grid column line 1, that's the start line. And -1 is the end line on the grid. In a left to right language, then line 1 is your left-hand line, and -1 is the far right. It'd be swapped over if you were working in a right to left language. And I'm saying start that after grid row 3, grid row line 3, and then we're doing the same with the black one. I've also got some which I've asked to span column tracks, so we're going to end up with some larger blocks on my grid, which gives me this. And we've got these kind of big gaps in the grid, and there's these sort of black bits are basically gaps in the grid as grid is laying these things out, because it's going to go through the source and it lays out things, and it comes across one that's too big to fit on the end of a row, and so it'll just drop down to the next row. And then it'll carry on until it finds another one that's too big, and then it'll drop down. So we end up with these kind of gaps in the grid, which is kind of what you'd normally want. You tend to want your source order to stay in the order that you put it in your document, unless we add the grid auto flow property with a value of dense. And that will mean that grid will backfill the gaps. As grid progresses forward, laying the items out, it comes across one that doesn't fit, and so it drops onto the next line. But the next time it finds one that will fit in that gap, it'll pick it up, take it out of source order, and put it into the space. So you get a nice, tightly packed display of boxes, which is great as long as you're displaying something that doesn't have a logical order. It would not be so cool for your forms. And it kind of highlights an issue that I like to drop in and just make people aware of, that with all of this, the grid layout particularly, but with Flexbox too, there is a very real ability to mess up the sort of logical order of your document. And in the spec for both Grid and Flexbox, it says that any reordering, either with auto placement or because you're just setting the columns and so on, it's only a visual thing. It doesn't affect the logical order of your document. So in terms of accessibility, you need to make sure the logical order of your documents make sense, even though we've got all this amazing ability to start to move things around. I think it's really a discussion that we're only just starting to have with Grid, because the Grid isn't actually live in any browsers yet. This is gridbyexample.com/browsers, which is my website of grid examples. I have an awful lot of them. If you go there, you can see the status currently in browsers. Grid has been developed behind browser flags. If anyone has worked with Flexbox, you may be aware that we kind of ended up with 3 versions of Flexbox in browsers, and this was a large nuisance to all of us. And this is because Flexbox was developed with prefixes, vendor prefixes, and the spec changed after browsers had implemented. And so we ended up with this sort of messy versions of Flexbox. Grid layout has been developed for, in fact, the last 5 years or so. It's been developed behind browser flags. There was an early Microsoft implementation. The spec came from Microsoft originally. So in IE 10, 11, and Edge, there is a kind of older version of grid layout. We've now got in Firefox and in Blink, so in Chrome and Opera. We've got a really good, and also in Safari technical preview, we've got a really good implementation of Grid. It is quite likely that come the first quarter of next year, it's going to ship in those browsers, at which point about 70% of people viewing the average website is probably going to have Grid support. And it's kind of done. If you enable experimental web platform features flags in Chrome, it's all there. All my examples work. You can have a play around with it. So in Flexbox and in the current implementations of Grid Layout, elements need to be a direct child of the element that you say display Flex or display Grid on to become Flex or Grid items. Now, Grid Layout does have a method sort of baked into the spec to enable subgrid support. So you could say that something was a subgrid, in which case it could use the grid defined sort of further up the tree, which would be very nice. It would enable us to kind of create a grid, and then the child items and also the children of those items could sit on the same grid. That would be nice. No one has yet implemented it. It's quite likely that that will get pushed into level 2 of the spec. Because no one's implementing it. But there is another value of display which can kind of get around this problem. It's already been implemented in Firefox, and it's called display contents. What display contents does is it stops an element generating any boxes. So the effect of that is it means that a child that is a direct child element of something which is set to display grid or display flex, the sort of boxes it would generate would disappear, and so its children could then be treated as grid or flex items, which sounds very, very strange indeed, and is much easier to see if you sort of play with an example. So here's some markup. I've got a div with a class of wrapper. It's got some direct children. The H1 is a direct child, the paragraphs, that block quote, and so is the unordered list with a class of images. However, the LI items inside are not a direct child, so they're not going to be affected by display grid being applied to wrapper. So this is what I'm doing. I'm creating this 2-column grid, and I'm setting those direct children, the H1, the paragraphs, to span right across the grid. The block quote has got a class of inset, so it goes in column after column 1, and the following paragraph goes after column line 2. And this gives us this sort of thing. You can see the 2 columns above of the quote and the text next to it. And then we've got those images which are inside a list, and so they don't lay out on the grid. What I'd like them to do is line up underneath the other columns, but because they're not direct children, they're not going to do that unless I use display contents. So we've got that UL with a class of images. We say display contents. And the effect of that is that the UL is no longer in the DOM for display purposes. It just sort of vanishes. And we end up being able to lay those items out. Auto placement will just place them on the grid. Very, very useful. You can use this already for flex items. It works in Firefox, and very nicely, Chrome have said that they're going to implement it as well. So we're getting that into browsers. I would love to see proper subgrid support land in browsers for grid as well. But this may well get us some of the way. A lot of the use cases that people have, I think, are probably solved by display contents. Certainly something to watch in the future as that gets more browser support. So moving away from big layout things, I'd like to talk a little bit about CSS Shapes, because it's a really nice little specification, and it's something that can work as an enhancement pretty well. The Shapes spec came from Adobe originally. It was one of their specifications. And it defines an ability for us to flow text in a curved line, or a line other than a sort of rectangular box. So to use Shapes, you have to float your item. It can only be, the level 1 spec can only be applied to floats. So here I've got an image here with a class of balloon, which I have floated left and given a width. And then I've used this shape outside property, which is what's defined in the spec. And I'm saying circle 50%, which gives me this, which is pretty nice. You don't need to wrap things around an image. You tend to see all the examples have things wrapped around images, but you don't need to do that. You need to float something, so you could float some generated content. So here I'm just generating some content, setting it to display block, floating it left, giving it a width and a height, and using shape outside again, which gives me this. So you can kind of have these curved lines without needing to put an image in there. As well as shapes, you can use clip path. It's from a different specification, but the nice thing about the clip path property is it takes the same values as shapes do. So once you've worked out what your shape is, you can also use clip path to clip away anything around, say, the image that you're curving your text around. So here I'm using my shape, and this time I'm using the ellipse function. You can also use a polygon to create really wacky shapes if you want to. And then I'm using WebKit clip path, which you need at the moment, and clip path with the same values. And that gives us this. And so that image is essentially rectangular, and we've just clipped away the content around it. You sort of see this kind of thing. I've seen it done like conference websites or anywhere where you've got like little avatars of people and they're all square. And you float them and you wrap the text around. And then if you've got shapes, you make them circular and wrap the text around in a curve, which is a really nice enhancement because it's not going to matter if people don't have the support for shapes. They're going to get the square image. It's going to be floated. It'll be fine. If you've got the support, then it's going to curve round. This is the current browser support for the Shapes spec. Pretty good. Firefox have said they're going to implement it, so hopefully we'll get it soon as well in Firefox. And as I say, it's the sort of thing that you could implement. People will see it if they've got Chrome, if they're using Safari, and then when Firefox updates, those people will also see it. It's probably not going to break anything. As long as you're fairly careful, you don't end up with, for instance, if you're clipping content away from an image and you've got stuff laid over it, there's a chance you could end up with something unreadable. So those are the kind of situations you need to be careful if using shapes. But CSS has come up with a solution for this browser support issue. Has anyone here used Modernizer or know what Modernizer is? Yeah, okay. So CSS feature queries is essentially Modernizer, the ability to detect support for a CSS feature. But instead of using JavaScript to do that, we can do that right inside our CSS. And we're using this @supports rule. It's a conditional group rule. It's a bit like media queries. And in this case, though, instead of testing how wide the viewport is, we're testing whether the user agent declares that it supports a CSS property and value pair, which means that we can write a style sheet that checks for support of a new CSS feature before using it, which means you can kind of do two things, and you can overwrite stuff you've done earlier for older browsers after checking for support. The thing with feature queries is they've got fantastic browser support. So your modern browsers all support feature queries, which means that nothing new is going to come into CSS from this day forwards, that you can't use feature queries to check whether it's there or not, which is pretty cool. So you can use this to implement new CSS without causing a problem for older browsers. So this is how you use it. Here I am checking to see if the browser has support for grid layout. So I'm saying @supports display grid. If we've got grid layout, do stuff for grid layout. You can test for multiple things as well. So here I'm checking for display grid and also shape outside circle. The fact that we're using property value pairs is really useful because if you know that a browser has got support for part of a spec but not all of it, which may happen, for instance, a browser might ship subgrid support in grid layout, you can just be looking for, you could look for display subgrid if you're looking for that part of the spec. You're not looking for the entire spec because very rarely do browsers actually ship with a completed specification. So even if you just know that something isn't implemented, you can look for it. It's a really nice way to test for support. Now, when I showed you the chart of compatibility for this, obviously this isn't supported in older versions of IE, but that doesn't really matter because what we do is when we use feature queries, you write your CSS for the old browsers or for the non-supporting browsers, then you do your feature query, and then you overwrite anything that you don't need, and then do your new stuff. So here with the balloon example from earlier, I'm going to give it a border and some padding for my non-shape supporting browsers. I test for support, and then I get rid of that border and the padding, and then I do my shape stuff inside the feature query. It's very much like when we do media queries, and we do something for mobile devices, and then we go to our wider layout, and maybe we take off some of that stuff and do some other things. Pretty much the same idea. And if we've got support, we get our nice clipped shape. And if we don't get support, we have this. We don't have any problems. It's a good way of making sure that your new CSS doesn't potentially cause problems for your older browsers. And I think they're a really exciting thing to start using. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't start using feature queries now to test for support of newer stuff. And they're just brilliant for creating these sort of websites that can enhance themselves as their platform improves underneath them, which is what's happening. With evergreen browsers, every other week someone's browser is going to update and they're going to get some new stuff. And feature queries let you sort of respond to that and build sites and applications that cope with that reality. So something with very little support, but which is pretty neat, is initial letter. I think probably most people doing front-end development and design have at some point tried to do like a proper drop caps effect. And it's a task that really isn't very easy, despite the fact that CSS has a very well-supported first-letter pseudo class. It's quite difficult to get a really nice drop caps effect, or it was until we got initial letter. So this is defined in the CSS inline layout model specification, and it lets us create proper initial letters in our documents. So here's how we use it. I'm targeting here the paragraph directly after an H1, and I'm setting the initial letter of that paragraph to bold and to be 4 lines tall. So that's the first value, therefore I'm saying 4 lines. The second value dictates whether the initial letter is completely in line with the content or kind of sticks out the top of the content. So I'm saying that it should be 3 lines embedded into the content. It's 4 lines tall, 3 lines embedded, which gives us this. So you can see how that W is 4 lines tall, but one of the lines is kind of stuck out the top of the content. So you can play around with that. You could have it completely inside if you wanted. Now, if there's not support for that, then we'll get this. Nothing will happen, because that's how CSS works. If a browser doesn't support something, it just doesn't do anything. So that's pretty much fine, as long as you don't want to do anything else to the initial letter, which browsers do support, because this is currently Safari 9 and up only. It is currently being implemented in Firefox. So if you were just going to make a big letter and it isn't supported, that's fine. But perhaps you want to start playing around and doing some additional styling. Here I'm doing some styling. I'm adding a background image and messing about with CSS Shapes. Now, the initial letter property is going to be ignored, but all that other stuff is not going to be ignored because most browsers support the pseudo class, and so we get this sort of thing going on. That's not ideal, but we've already got a solution. We've got feature queries, so we can test for that initial letter support and then put the CSS for it inside a feature query. So we do this, we check for support of initial letter, and if we have got support, we get this, which probably isn't a lot better, but I'm not a designer. So that's, but you can see that you can test for the support and then do what you want. So feature queries, if you take one thing away, feature queries, they really are your new best friend. You can start using these things. Staying with content, writing modes. Now, when I joined the CSS working group, what I hadn't realized is that actually most of the discussions, most of the time, are about the direction of things being written. So it turns out it's very complicated, whether things go from left to right or right to left or top to bottom, or whether you have content which is mixed, some of it going from right to left and some of it going from top to bottom. And it's very, very complicated. And many, many amazing discussions occur about writing modes. And there's this whole specification to deal with writing modes. But you don't just need to use these for creating text in other languages. You can use them to play around with text in your own language. So obviously I'm using English, which is a left to right language, and I've got a heading here. And I've decided that I'd quite like to have my heading tipped over on the side and displayed down the side of the document. And I can do that with a combination of grid and writing modes. So I'm doing a few things here. I've set my wrapper to display grid. I'm creating a 2-column grid with a grid gap. And then on my H1, I'm saying writing mode vertical RL. I'm also using transform to flip it over and aligning the text and putting it after grid column line 1, which gives me this. So that's kind of a neat trick, but the other place where this sort of thing is quite useful, I was sent an example by someone who wanted to know how I would do a layout with grid, and it had a bunch of buttons that were down the side and the text was sort of flipped over, so the text was actually sort of down the side of the button. And you do that with writing mode. So you can create a kind of application UI with the text on its side, again, using the writing mode spec. So that's a fairly neat spec. Pretty good support. Better support than you would imagine. So, a couple of things that you might expect to find in a preprocessor rather than as native CSS. I think the reason most of us started using preprocessors, or the reason we consider it, is, the first thing we think is it'd be really nice to have variables in my CSS. I am fed up with searching and replacing through all these CSS files to find the colors or the fonts or whatever it is. And so you use a preprocessor like Sass or less, so you can use variables. So we've brought these into the CSS specs now, and the spec that deals with variables is called custom properties. So custom properties, it means that authors can define properties, you can set them up, and then you can use them in your CSS files. Here's a simple example. So here I'm just setting up some colors. I've got a primary color, which I've set to blue, and secondary to orange. And then in my H1, instead of having the color, I say var, and then I choose my custom property that I would like to use. Something that's pretty cool is you can use feature queries to test for them. So you can test if you've got support for those custom properties before you use them, which means that you could have defaults and then overwrite them with your custom properties if you know that you have support, which is pretty neat. And that's just a link to that example, so you can have a look at that later. Getting there, other than Edge, there's something we need to chase for. But yeah, again, reasonable support. It's getting there. We've got quite a bit of support for this stuff. And so the other thing that we do with preprocessors is we add things up. We do basic mathematics. And you might think, well, why bother? Most of us are probably using Sass or less at this point. Why bother doing this stuff in CSS? The key thing about the calc function in CSS that lets us do this basic mathematics is that you can mix length units. You can't do something like, in your preprocessor, you can't say, take 20 pixels away from 50%. Because you don't know at the time you run that preprocessor, you don't know what 50% is. 50% of what? How big is it? So you can't do that. Whereas with calc in CSS, you can actually do that. You can mix the units. So I've got a very quick example of that. Got some boxes here, and inside they've got another div nested inside them, just so we can play around with some heights and see how this works. So I've defined a height for two of them. The first one is just going to take the height of the content, so it's whatever content is in there. And then this targets all of those inner divs, everything inside box. And what we're saying for its height is that it should be 50% of its container minus 20 pixels. And we get this. So the minus 20 pixels is to deal with the fact the box is absolutely positioned from the bottom there. So if we said 50%, it would be taller than actual 50% because we've not taken into account that 20 pixels. So by removing the 20 pixels from the height, we get these half-height boxes. Somewhere else where calc's very useful is positioning background images, making sure that they actually are defined the right way from the bottom. You can use it for that. But yeah, anywhere you need to mix length units in your CSS, calc is incredibly handy. And it's got really good browser support. You can pretty much use this. And so that's something that you can be starting to use. I think if you've got stuff that's pretty much absolute, you can do it in your preprocessor. But there are places where it can be really handy to roll that out actually into your live CSS. So as well as looking at stuff we're doing in preprocessors and sort of taking ideas from that, we're starting to see things in CSS that we've done like forever with JavaScript. You know, for years and years, we've been doing certain things with JavaScript that are now starting to go into native specs, which just means they're going to be more performant. If it's a native CSS thing rather than having to happen in JavaScript, it's pretty much going to work a lot nicer. So this is one of those things. This is a new value of the position property, sticky. So sticky positioning is when you've got something positioned in your document and you start scrolling, and it scrolls fine with the text, just as normal. And then when it hits, say, the top of the viewport, it stays put, and the text then scrolls underneath it. Common thing for like navigation and so on. You can start in the middle of your document, get to the top, and then start scrolling. So it's a bit different to sort of having something static, which then starts in a place and always stays there. You've got that nice effect of it moving first and then staying. So this is how we do that. I've got a list of elements with definition terms followed by multiple definition. And I want the terms to stick as we scroll. So what we need to do for that is say position sticky, and then we say top 0. And that means that I want it to get stuck when it hits the top of the viewport, rather than partway up. You could have a value there if you wanted it to stick a bit further down. And we get this sort of thing happening. So you can see as they hit the top, they stick, and the things scroll underneath them. So that's a fairly neat effect. As I say, it's something that we've been doing with JavaScript for a long time anyway. And there's your browser support. It is coming into Chrome, as you can see. Future versions of Chrome have it. It's in Canary, certainly, and it's flagged in other Chromes. It's also a good candidate to polyfill. You can polyfill this. We're already doing this with JavaScript, so it's a pretty good candidate to, just use position sticky if it's there, and if not, use some JavaScript to fake it. Or you could just leave it out. If a browser doesn't support position sticky, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to scroll as normal, which in that kind of case would be absolutely fine. And scroll snapping. This is a very interesting spec. So this is the sort of thing, when you're scrolling through an interface, either left to right or top to bottom, you've got something that's more like an app, perhaps. Once you get past a certain point, the scrollable item kind of jumps to the next pane. So you get that nice effect. You're not kind of having to kind of scroll it into view and then try and get it lined up. It's going to jump to where you'd expect it to be. And there's a new CSS specification that deals with scroll snapping. It's at candidate recommendation status, but it has very, very recently changed. So the code that works currently in browsers is not the final stuff that we'll be using for scroll snapping, which is pretty much the way of brand new specifications. Until things get to candidate recommendation, they're kind of up for grabs. Things might change, and which is why things are typically happening behind browser flags these days, so we can kind of mess around with them and figure out the best way to do things. So patchy browser support, as I say, the stuff that is implemented is a slightly older spec. But this is pretty cool, and it's kind of nice to see how this works. So this demo currently works in Firefox. The changes to the spec lose the scroll snap destination and combine the scroll snap points Y property into scroll snap type. But it's roughly similar to what you will see. So you can have a play with the example. And you can see you're sort of pulling it, you drag that over, and you drag it over, and until it gets past the midpoint, and then it snaps into place. So it's quite a nice effect, especially if you're building something which wants to behave more like an app. And we can go the other way. So you can scroll on the y-axis. Again, this is the old spec. So then you just can drag up and down until you go over the midpoint, and it then jumps up. So quite a nice thing, but I think quite a nice example of how stuff that we're trying to do, and we're doing with JavaScript, often in not a great way or not a particularly performant way, is coming into the CSS specs so that we can sort of try and use that in a better way. Which really leads me on to, I've shown you a whole bunch of stuff here that's pretty new, and some of it only works in one browser, and scroll snapping still needs updating. And I've shown you how CSS gives you a method to deal with lack of support. But especially with kind of big layout methods, we need those in all the browsers for us to be able to rely on them. You're not going to risk your entire layout on something which only has support in one browser. And polyfilling your whole layout isn't likely to result in a very good sort of end result for you or your users. But the thing is that we, as web developers, can do an awful lot to encourage adoption of these features by browsers. Tell browser vendors that you want this stuff. raise bugs against stuff that is not working, add your vote to things like the Edge user voice site. You know, if you want shapes in Edge, go and tell them. Also, if you can see a good use case for these features and you can't use them because they're not supported in a certain browser, write about it, talk about it. You know, make sure it gets out there. So when browser vendors are looking, you know, do web developers care about this stuff? If they can only find me writing about Grid, then they're not going to go and implement stuff. So I think that's the important thing, is that there is noise about this stuff. And if we all sit there and say, well, I can't use it, so I'm not even going to look at it, we don't get them. And so it really is very, very important to make your thoughts known with the browser vendors and just out there on your blog or on Medium or wherever you write stuff on Twitter, so that they know that there is call for it, and that if they implement it, developers are going to be like, yay, we've got it, and we can build more stuff. That's really important. And also, with my CSS Working Group hat on, if you see any of these features and think that the CSS Working Group have totally lost the plot, then let us know. If you have a use case that isn't solved by some new CSS specification, let us know. We want to know about it. Or just write about it and, you know, just tweet about it, because we're watching. And when we have conversations on the weekly call or at the face-to-faces, quite often the question is asked, what do web developers, what do authors actually think about this feature? Do they want it? Are they using it? Are they having problems with it? What do they think it should be called? A lot of the discussions are about just like, what should we call this thing? And we never know. And so, you know, I'll be on a call Googling to see if anybody has written about this yet, and sort of creating lists of that stuff. So if you're out there writing about it, and writing about the use cases you've got, it definitely gets listened to. And it literally can be 3 or 4 people writing about something can mean it gets implemented and, you know, gets put into a specification, because you find there aren't that many people writing about early stage CSS. So you can get your voice heard. And particularly if you're someone who writes JavaScript and things, and you're building stuff which is, you know, interesting and could be solved natively, we'd like to know about that. All of the CSS specifications are now discussed on GitHub. They were moved this year to GitHub out of the horrendous mailing list that I could never encourage anybody to go and look at. It really was like something out of the 90s. It's now all on GitHub, where every other open source project is. So you can come along, you can search for different specifications, and you can see which issues are raised, which a lot of those come up during the calls, and we put them on there. You can even raise new issues yourself. You know, particularly if a spec is, you know, not a final spec, you know, let us know if you think things are called stupid things or whatever, or if it's not doing something you need, because it may well get discussed and brought up. And you really are, you know, sort of doing your future self a favor by doing this stuff, because in a year, in 2 years, it's going to be out there in browsers. Things are happening very, very quickly these days, and you can actually really influence that. And speaking for myself, you know, I'm not affiliated to a browser vendor. I do all my CSS Working Group stuff really as kind of like a weird hobby. But I really enjoy it. I get a lot from contributing to this stuff and actually finding out the inner workings of it all. It's been really interesting. So it's kind of interesting just to listen in. If there's particular specs you're interested in, go follow them on GitHub. And please do offer your thoughts. We'd really like to hear them. So all of my slides and code and so on are at that link. Thank you very much for listening. Everyone wants out of this very hot room.
Then I have one, which is, you mentioned that the CSS queries allows for checking for the availability of newer features, but I'm unsure what your recommendation regarding grid layout actually is. Do you suggest to just play with it now, or use it now to just be ready when things start? When is the good time to start using those very advanced things?
Right. I mean, so grid's an interesting one because it's all kind of there, but we can't, unless you're not going to tell your users to take off an experimental web platform features flag. The thing with grid is it's very likely that it's going to end up in browsers early next year, but that can't be guaranteed. You know, any browser could decide that there was some showstopper with performance or something and not ship it until later in the year. I think it's certainly worth starting to learn now, because when it does ship, it's going to land pretty much complete across those browsers. So there's a good chance, and particularly if, you know, you've got a use case for that, The implementation in Chrome, interestingly, has been paid for by Bloomberg. They paid the open source consultancy Agalia to develop it and put it into Blink. So they obviously have a use for it and are probably very keen to see it out there. So it's certainly worth having a look at, because it's a big spec, there's a lot to it, and if you can start to get a head start on understanding Grid, it'll be useful to you certainly in a year's time. It's not something, even once it is in browser, it's not something I would suggest polyfilling. What I would suggest is that you start to use it for components. Grid is brilliant for laying out little components and like really tweaking the alignment and getting a nice display of stuff. And when you work on a kind of micro level, it's easier to fall back to a simpler display for things that don't support. And once we're talking about 70, 80% of people having Grid, which we could well have through next year, it makes more sense to start, use feature queries, detect for support of Grid, do a nicer layout, enhancing a plainer one. I think generally using stuff as an enhancement as much as possible, rather than trying to do any nasty kind of polyfilling of this stuff, is probably a better idea.
Thank you. Yes.
When I do feature testing in JavaScript, I can lazy load content. Whereas like if I do an add import inside an add supports, it would get loaded every single time. Is there a thought in the spec how user agents have to deal with that?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that's something you could do. I don't think there's anything in the spec that particularly would deal with that. That's an interesting thought. We should talk about that.
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, and thanks a lot, Rachel.
Thank you.